Well, good evening. Happy Hanukkah to everybody. Welcome to our regulars and welcome to any new people if you're listening, if you're watching with us this week. Now, because we moved this session to a Thursday night, we're unable to stream to J-Air as they have a program scheduled on now, but we are back to our regular Wednesday night sessions from next week. My name is Alan Friedman. I'm Vice President of the Australian Jewish Association, and I'm pleased to have as my co-host tonight, Michael Bird, my former Nothing Left partner. Good evening to you, Michael.
Good evening, Alan.
Thanks for joining me. And also visible on your screens are Ruthie Blum, who we will formally introduce in a moment. Now, David Adler, President of the AJA, was here, but he is in fact at this very moment at the Sky News studio in Sydney, waiting to appear on Rowan Dean's show. So he's disappeared for a few minutes and he will come back to us after he finishes his interview. Our format will be the usual. Michael and I will chat with Ruthie for about 30 minutes, after which we will open up for questions from the audience. Just in case you're new to Zoom, you can ask a question by raising your hand electronically. The way you do this is to click on the reactions icon at the bottom of the screen. That sends a signal to us, and then we can see that you're in line waiting to ask a question. As we are now doing, if you prefer to submit a written question, this can be done in the chat function, and we will read out some of those in between the spoken ones. Now, Robert Gregory, our Public Affairs Director, usually does this, but he is also not with us tonight. So we will try to monitor the written questions as we have been doing the past few weeks. But please understand if we might miss one. The chat function is available as usual. You can go to gallery view or speaker view by clicking the little icon in the right-hand corner of your screen. Now, our audience tonight will need no reminding of the Obama administration's 8 terrible years towards Israel. We did have a 4-year reprieve with Donald Trump, but it now appears as if we are returning to the previous cooler Democrat friendship, driven by the strange notion that if Israel was only nicer to the Palestinians and made more concessions, then peace would break out all over the Middle East. Ruthie Blum had a book published in 2012 titled To Hell in a Handbasket, Carter, Obama and the Arab Spring, and it is a chilling account of how Jimmy Carter's abandonment of a long-time US ally in favour of a murderous mullah 30 years ago enabled the Islamization of Iran. This was followed, of course, by Barack Obama's appeasement of the radical Muslim world, which only further helped Islamize the rest of the Middle East. Many of us will be familiar with Ruthie's articles in the Jerusalem Post and the Jewish News Syndicate, where she also works as an editor. Originally from New York City, she moved to Israel in 1977 and currently resides in Tel Aviv. She is the winner of the Louis Rappaport Award for Excellence in Commentary. Michael and I enjoyed speaking with Ruthie several times on Nothing Left, and we're delighted to have her with us tonight. Ruthie, nice to catch up with you again, and welcome down under and to the Australian Jewish Association.
Thank you so much. We're so far away that it's morning. It's Thursday morning for me. Yeah. I'll tell you what, this is what I'd like to start with. The title of this talk has to do with the abandonment, the Democrats' abandonment of Israel. But there's a very important point here, and that is that there is no abandonment of Israel without the abandonment of America. I disagree with many of my fellow conservatives or right-wingers, if you want to call them, who say that the Democratic Party is anti-Semitic or that Barack Obama was an anti-Semite. I disagreed with that. What they are, so, no, today's Democratic Party certainly has anti-Semites in it, many. But the point about the Democratic Party is not that it's anti-Israel, but that it's anti-America. And as it's anti-America, Israel follows. And this we can see with Jimmy Carter for sure. I wrote that book. Why did I write that book? How did that come about? Somebody commissioned me to write a book about Jimmy Carter, who had a couple of years earlier published the book Palestine, Peace, Not Apartheid. And I was commissioned to write a scathing attack on Carter and the way he handled his presidency and in the years following. Partially, I would say a few months into my research on this book, the so-called Arab Spring erupted, starting with the self-immolation in Tunisia of a vendor, and then it began to spread all over the place. So I realized that this book had to be changed, and it had to be changed to show how Jimmy Carter's Islamization or assistance in Islamization of Iran had an effect over the years and led up to the Obama administration. Now, you have to understand how Jimmy Carter had a dim view of America. Well, what do I mean by a dim view of America? Jimmy Carter was a religious Christian, taught Sunday school. He was an old style Democrat, supposedly, not a radical, which is one of the reasons he was elected, by the way, presenting the party as the kind of Democrat that used to be the old sense of the word liberal. He turned out to be, of course, very radical, not a liberal. What he did, if you consider what he did when 50-something US diplomats were taken hostage by radicals in Iran after the Ayatollah Khomeini arrived and the Shah of Iran was banished, was exiled. What Carter did was to say, there's nothing much you can do if your people are captured, basically. I mean, he wrote entries in his diary that were in the initial stage when the hostages were taken that were more about local elections and taxes and other things. He really didn't take it as seriously as he should have initially. More importantly, his attitude towards that, it was a huge violation. If you think about it, America is the greatest superpower in the world. And a little country like Iran that has just been taken over by radicals takes your embassy hostage, and you, A, didn't know that that was about to happen, and B, your response to it is to send envoys to try to suck up to the Ayatollah and his people and beg that the hostages be released. It didn't work, of course, and by the time Carter came around to agreeing to a rescue operation by Delta Force, it was a mess and the operation failed, mainly because of weather conditions. Now, it's very important when the world looks at an American president whose attitude is that America is not superior to other countries and is willing to kowtow to little despots who actually it should be the other way around. They should be cowering at the feet of the United States. Now, it's interesting that the Ayatollahs, I mean, the followers of the Ayatollah, understood this very well because their original plan had been to take hostages at the Soviet embassy, and they opted against that, probably because they figured that they would all be slaughtered within 2 seconds if they touched the Russian embassy. Okay, they understood that America was a safer target. And this began a serious tragedy of how the Democrats began to evolve into what they are today. It also predated Jimmy Carter in the sense that after the 1967 Six-Day War, Israel was, up until the Six-Day War, Israel, even among Democrats, even among left-wing American Democrats, Israel was still considered the David to the Goliath of the Arab world. After 67, that view switched, and gradually, as American leftists tend to do, there's always an underdog. The underdog, as we can see today with the Black Lives Matter movement, the underdog is are people of color or people who are poor, whatever. And Israel, because it had emerged victorious and was succeeding and flourishing, became viewed in a less positive light. So it wasn't Jimmy Carter that began that. On the contrary, it was over the years, this kind of attitude was seriously ensconced in liberal America. In fact, it was the election that ousted Jimmy Carter, when Ronald Reagan became elected, that even many Jews switched over to the Republican Party and voted for Reagan, because Jimmy Carter had gone too far. And in his view that America, actually Jimmy Carter was saying, you know, we are in bad shape. And Ronald Reagan came along and said two things. One thing he said was, America is great, and we will not put up with this kind of thing, like taking hostage, our embassy staff hostage. But he also said that America is superior, not on a par with, certainly not inferior to other countries and other cultures. And his kind of optimism, and similar to what Trump said in his campaign, making America great again, is what Americans wanted to hear. Also, under Jimmy Carter, the American economy was in the toilet, and the hostages were languishing. You realize they spent a year and a quarter in captivity. It is outrageous. And the day that Ronald Reagan was inaugurated, they were freed.
Yes.
Now, it is not that America as a whole, it has a dim view of itself. On the contrary, what we can see is that every election, the pendulum swings back and forth. After Carter came Reagan, and after that, the pendulum keeps swinging back and forth. And another important thing to remember is that though America elects a president, we say we voted for Trump, we voted for Obama, the president is just one guy. It's the administration behind him that has to concern you when you're voting. And this brings us now to Biden. A lot of people made fun of Biden. He's senile, he doesn't know what he's doing. Biden is kind of irrelevant in a way because he has a whole administration behind him. That's the thing you have to look at. And that is why when he was running and the Democrats decided that it would be too risky to have as their candidate somebody as radical and Marxist as Bernie Sanders. And Biden was like an old style Democrat, kind of palatable to mainstream America. But it didn't matter, you see, because his administration is extremely radical. And his administration definitely has a dim view of the United States and the West in general. Now, Obama, if we look at what Obama did when he came to power and before that, and he ran on this campaign, Obama went to Europe and made a speech where he said, we're all the same. We're not better than you. Now, if you think about that, the president of the United States goes to a failing continent and, to little countries that rely on America for protection, and says to them, we're all the same. It really doesn't matter. So that's why Israel, in a way, is secondary to this, or it's part of it. The view of Israel is part of this overall horrifying view that the West is not superior to the third world. So since Israel doesn't belong in the third world, Israel goes in that category as well. So that's a very important point here. Now, when we talk about what's happening today with Iran, what we can see is that Biden, like Obama was the one who begged the Iranians to sign a deal that was a terrible deal to begin with. And in any case, you can't sign a deal with actors like that. It's like the deals with Palestinians. They're not worth the paper they're written on in the first place. Even if they were good deals, they're not worth anything, because you're dealing with liars. Part of their culture is that it's okay to lie in order to achieve your goals. And it doesn't really matter. You know, the main thing is you get the most you can, and then you work out, you deal with it later. So that's what happened with the Iranians. The Iranians eventually blackmailed, extorted so much from the Obama administration, and that it agreed to sign the deal. I mean, that Tehran deigned to sign a deal with world powers, and then proceeded, of course, to violate the deal. But again, the deal itself wasn't a good deal to begin with, because even if they hadn't violated it by now, it would have been expired, so to speak. Yeah. So now enter the Biden administration.
Ruthie, just before we get to the Biden administration, yes, can we just backtrack a little bit to the history?
Sure. Sure.
With Jimmy Carter, I mean, we're a long way from the United States, obviously. So when we looked at all that was happening, what we saw was a weak president in terms of the hostage situation. But it sounds like what you're saying is that there was a bit of an ideological shift with the Democrats that happened at that time. Were the American people, did they realize that this is what was going on?
Well, yes. I mean, that's why he was not elected for a second term. Americans, first of all, it's an interesting thing about Americans, because when the America you see, the vociferous America, the America you see in the media is actually not that radical. The greater part of America is made up of people who are very patriotic, who are family oriented, who go to church, who care about values, and yet somehow these radicals end up in power constantly. Americans were not happy that the hostages were held that long. They were disgusted. They felt humiliated, disgraced, horrified. That's one thing. And the other thing is that Americans vote according to the economy, and the economy was a disaster. But your point is well taken. We often talk about failed leaders or weak leaders, when in fact, if you look at Obama, for example, Obama was not a failed president. He was hugely successful at implementing the agenda that he set out to implement, which was to weaken America. And his mentor had been Saul Alinsky, the author of Rules for Radicals, whose basic worldview was that you infiltrate the institutions in your country from within to exact change. Obama had been a community organizer. These are basically Marxists with strong unions and against all kinds of liberal values, liberal in the classical sense, free market, freedom of choice, freedom of religion, etc.
Yeah.
Obama was not failed. And though Biden is weak in his person, Biden is actually, I think that what's being done to Biden is cruel. I think it's cruel by his wife and by his party to put him in that position when he's clearly not all there, and it's a disgrace, actually.
Ruthie, sorry to butt in.
No, sure.
I want to ask you, where does Bill Clinton fit into this evaluation of Democratic US presidents? I mean, was his driving of the Oslo Accords that culminated with the handshake between Arafat and Rabin consistent with your premise of capitulation to the Islamic world, so to speak?
Well, I think that Bill Clinton is slightly an exception to the other Democratic presidents. His wife, on the other hand, is not. His wife, as an ideologue, is not an exception. He himself, basically, it was interesting because the economy flourished under Bill Clinton because he didn't really care about the rest of the stuff. He's not an ideologue in the way that Hillary is. He was busy with his other things, and I don't mean just Monica Lewinsky, but because he sort of left things alone. And when the government leaves things alone, the economy flourishes. That's the fact. So he did some good things. And it's hard to blame Clinton entirely for Oslo when the Israeli government was pushing for it. Okay, so, that handshake on the White House lawn, let's put it this way. Many pressures from the Obama administration, subsequent pressures by Obama on former Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, that was pressure. And whereas with Clinton, you had an Israeli government that was similar to the Democrats in the sense that the fantasy of land for peace, the fantasy that Arafat had changed his stripes, all of that, so I find it a little hard to say, hey, let's not be more Catholic. You can't expect America to be more Catholic than the Pope, so to speak. And so the Israeli government, I really hold the Israeli government responsible for pushing so hard for that. Oslo really similar to the Iran deal, when America was begging Iran to accept it. You had Yitzhak Rabin's government and Shimon Peres pushing hard for Arafat to accept the deal. Yeah. We later saw that with Ehud Barak when he was prime minister, basically saying, please take everything you want, please, please, please. And, that resulted, of course, in the suicide bombing war against Israel that took place, called the Second Intifada. The point here is that, so Clinton is slightly an exception. And interestingly, although he certainly was guided by his wife, she was guided by him as well. I mean, he is responsible for her career, but she was the ideologue, the Saul Alinskyite of the couple.
Okay. Ruthie, just thinking about the recent conflict between Israel and Hamas, Biden generally said the right sorts of things. So how do you assess his administration in terms of what he actually said at that time?
I think the Biden administration, what its mistake, or on purpose, is to, first of all, to make a huge distinction between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah, between Hamas and Fatah, or the PLO. It's very easy when you have the bad guy in Hamas, you can then say, okay, that's a group of terrorists, and then there's also Islamic Jihad terrorists in Gaza. And, meanwhile, we've got to make peace with Ramallah, and we've got to get Palestinian Authority Chairman Mahmoud Abbas to have a unity government with Hamas so they can have peace and then they can have peace with Israel. It's still part of the same left-wing fantasy that's ridiculous. So, he said some of the right things, although, again, the people surrounding him made clear to say, hey, don't use disproportionate force. You had the Democratic members of Congress, so-called the squad, viciously attacking Israel for its behavior, totally lying about what was going on during that conflict.
Yeah, Michael?
Ruthie, just changing tack a little bit. Approximately 80% of American Jews vote Democrat, which is possibly, I view one of the most anti-Semitic political parties in history. And now that most of the wealthy and influential pro-Israel Jews are either much older or no longer with us, has Israel lost the next generation of American Jews to other priorities such as, climate change and gender issues, refugees, and all the other woke issues, with Israel's security way down on the list? Is that how you see things?
Oh, definitely. I definitely see it like that. And also, American Jews have a history of belonging to the Democratic Party. And there was a time when that made sense. It stopped making sense about 50, 60 years ago, but that didn't change. As I said, there was a little blip when Reagan ran for president. The Jewish vote increased by a little bit for the Republican Party, but it went back. It went back down after that. Jews they have I think, totally irrational love for the Democratic Party. It makes no sense in terms of economics, for example. It makes no sense in terms where Israel is concerned. But there you have it, because Jews have their most important issues, as we see. They care most about abortion, climate change, and even every movement like Black Lives Matter. Every movement that goes against Jewish interests, they support. The American Jews support. As for the younger generation, we don't really know what's happening with that. You're right that the younger generation may not know anything about Israel, but let's face it, the younger generation in the world today, including in Israel, is very ignorant. There's not a lot of education out there. You think American Jews are ignorant about Israel? They also are ignorant about America. They're ignorant about literature. They're ignorant about culture. They're ignorant about history. So no wonder they also tend, you can see the younger generation, it seems to act as though there was no history before they came along. It's actually very tragic. So, I would also worry about Israeli Jews not being educated enough in their own history, not just American Jews or Australian Jews.
Yeah. Ruthie, we've all watched, when we're all watching Joe Biden appearing to struggle significantly with the office, and as you said, it's really very sad. Are there people pulling his strings? Is he the puppet? And are there people pulling his springs? And who might they be? I mean, we from this distance, I think of Pelosi and Schumer or the squad. Is that what's happening, do you think?
Definitely. But, you don't even need to have him have the squad pull his strings, because the squad is not part of the administration. The squad is part of Congress. He's got a whole team there. Malley and Blinken. He's got a whole team of people who were either architects of the Iran deal and or Palestinian, pro-Palestinian and pro-Palestinian state, right? So he's got a lot of people in place there who can do the work for him. So, even, that, as I said, even if he weren't losing it, that would be the case. He definitely is not capable of doing any of this stuff on his own. But if you want to know if there's one sort of ray of light that I see in all of this is, and I spoke about the pendulum, it swings back and forth. Obama was so radical that he ushered in the election of Donald Trump that at the time was just, nobody could believe that Donald Trump, in the first place, would win the nomination as the Republican candidate. Nobody believed it. I certainly didn't believe it. Nobody did, and I don't think Donald Trump himself believed it. But that he became president was just uncanny. And it was uncanny because he hadn't been part of the political establishment. He hadn't even really been a Republican. He was friends with Democrats. He was friends with the Clinton. He was a reality TV star. He's a business, a real estate mogul. It just seemed incredible. And it was worrisome for many of us. We thought, uh-oh, what's going to happen? And he also sounded a little bit like an isolationist. And lo and behold, in he comes. And Israel has never had a more pro-Israel president. He entered office and began one by one to implement policies that he promised that he would do in his campaign at lightning speed, okay? And if he hadn't gone, let's say, gone so far on Twitter, he would have had a resounding victory a second time around because the economy was booming. The trouble was the pandemic. The pandemic started killing economies everywhere, and leaders everywhere were blamed for it, which is what happens to you when you live in a country. You blame your leaders. So, had the pandemic not come along, maybe Trump would still be in office. Yes. But the point about that is that now the Biden administration is also very radical. Well, and Congress, the Democratic Congress women in particular, but also congressmen, are just incredibly left-wing radical, and they're going to be punished for it because first of all, they already have in some of the midterm elections, they're going to be punished because Americans do not want their energy supply to be cut off. They don't want the country to be viewed as an imperialist, evil place that's inherently racist. America is not inherently racist. And you have Congress women saying it's inherently racist. You have people knocking down statues of all of the great heroes of America and banning books. And, the cancel culture has gotten so out of hand that you have stores banning Harry Potter books. Yeah. And why? Because their author dared to say that a person who menstruates is a woman. So the transgender community went against her, and that was the end of that.
But Ruthie, yes, sorry, but just with Biden,
yes,
is there a cabal, a group of a few people that are actually telling him what to do, do you think?
I'm sure.
Or I mean, because you said that he's beholden a lot to the people he appointed, but would they then turn it around and tell him what to do? Or is there an external group that are actually pulling the strings?
I really don't know. I don't know. And I don't like to engage in any kind of conspiracy theory. I think it's very clear that he's incapable of doing all this stuff on his own. You can see it. I mean, it's clear. So you don't need, it's not rocket science in that respect. What is important, however, is that his administration, again, even if he were in charge of things, he has an entire administration behind him and a party behind him that puts pressure on him. As I said, even if he weren't suffering from some form of dementia, he still would have those pressures. And he still would be persuaded, or at least tried to be persuaded that America, that climate change is the greatest danger of the century, and that a better Iran deal will prevent Iran from having a bomb and a nuclear bomb and things like that. That is the worldview there.
Yeah, just I was going to ask one more question before we go to the audience, because I think there's a lot of people who want to ask you questions. But progressive left-wing Jews, both in the United States and Australia, have become Israel's staunchest critics.
Yes.
And leading the pack are Soros-funded J Street and New Israel Fund. Under Obama, yes, J Street boasted that they had the ear of the President of the United States and urged his administration to get tougher with Israel. How much damage do these anti-Zionists actually do to Israel's image generally and to Israel-US relations, in your opinion?
Okay, it's a great question, especially the second part about Israel-US relations. I'll start with the first part, J Street and the New Israel Fund, etc. The serious damage they inflict, and it is serious, is political in the sense that the Israel's enemies can hold them up as an example. You see, these are pro-Israel, so-called pro-Israel Jews, and look at them. They also think that Israel is abusing the Palestinians, is going to become an apartheid state, is going to become, is undemocratic. And so they're the perfect face. You see, then you can't even be accused of being anti-Semites because you have J Street and you have the New Israel Fund, and they profess to be pro-Israel. You see, anti-Israel is the new pro-Israel, is what I keep saying. And so now to the second part, US-Israel relations. The biggest lie that the current Israeli government has been promoting and has been for years, the people who were against Netanyahu, the biggest lie is that he is at fault for what they call the rift between, or making Israel a partisan issue in the United States. In other words, it's Bibi's fault that the Republicans and Democrats are split on Israel. Now, this is a huge lie. It was the other way around. It's that the Republicans consider Israel America's true ally and the Democrats don't. And Netanyahu was operating in that sphere. He was operating when he went to Congress to appeal at the time. The Congress invited him, a Republican Congress at the time. I mean, it was a joint session of both houses of Congress, and the Republicans wanted to hear what he had to say about the Iran deal when he made the appeal. And Israelis against Netanyahu said, how dare he do that? And look what he's doing. And he's created this rift. And the current administration the current Israeli government, headed by Naftali Bennett and Yair Lapid, continue to insist that they're going to do it better because they know how to make friends. They're going to go on both sides of the aisle. Well, good luck to them. It doesn't work.
Okay, we're going to go to questions. Thank you, Ruthie. We've got a few people lined up and I want to get a couple of written questions in, but so everybody please keep your questions short and we'll try to get through them. Ron, we've got Ron, Reuven, Terry and Jeff to start with. So Ron, please unmute yourself and ask your question. Ron? Okay,
can you hear me?
You're right.
Okay. Hi, Ruthie, this is Ron speaking. Jews in America often spoke of America as a golden Medina. Why on earth would they want to disempower the golden Medina for them, number one? And number two, is American Jewry actually salvageable? Has Birthright really been a success given the reality? The Birthright program I'm talking about.
You know, it's a good question. Jews America was the greatest country for Jews, really. I mean, that's before Israel, before Israel was established as a state. And why Jews stopped remembering that is both a function of the generations that have passed, things. And once you actually are successful and all that, you tend to forget your roots, right? That's one thing. And then you also begin to take for granted all the gifts that you have. And rather than appreciating them, you tend to take them for granted and then complain about the rest of it. The other question about whether American Jewry is salvageable is something that I really don't have an answer for, because I think that will depend largely. I don't know if it's true that it depends on what you call Jewish education, because if you pay attention to to most Jewish education in America, it's also very progressive and woke. Okay, it's not. So what we see happening is that the dichotomy between Orthodox Jews in America and non-Orthodox Jews in America is huge. And that if there's any hope, it appears that only Orthodox Jews are getting a proper Jewish education, what I would consider a proper Jewish education, even though I'm not Orthodox at all. They're getting a proper education, and they're learning about their Judaism, they're learning Hebrew, they're learning the Bible, etc. The other Jews, even in Jewish day schools, they're learning, they're twisting Judaism. Look, Judaism is adaptable. There's no question about it. It's not that even the Orthodox have one voice about what Judaism is. And rabbis have always disputed what real Judaism is. But I'm not talking about that. I'm not talking about different strains of Judaism. I'm talking about the focus on Jewish education in many of the liberal day schools, teaching more about Black Lives Matter and more about white privilege and abortion and transgenderism and whatever than they are about Judaism, or they're incorporating it in. I've been to synagogues, let's say Reform synagogues and conservative synagogues, where the rabbi was, he might as well have been, writing an op-ed for the New York Times.
We have that here as well.
Yeah, and so, it's possible that the same thing is happening in Israel, that, ironically, for people like me, who's not religious and certainly not Orthodox, I would, hate to see the two choices being either orthodoxy or nothing, woke disdain for our Judaism.
Ruthie,
I hope that's not going to happen.
No, just picking up on one of the written questions from Robert, and he asks, have Jews learned anything? It sounds like you've answered it, but is that did anything further to say on that? Have the American Jews learned anything from the way the Democrats are treating Israel?
I would say, if so, very few have learned something from it. But as you and I were speaking before the guests came on Zoom, yeah. This is not new. Jews who got out of the land of Egypt, Moses got them out of the land of Egypt. They said, let's go back, right? So the ability of Jews to learn something, I'm not sure. It's a good question.
Okay.
Jews really do have this need, for some reason, to champion everybody's rights except our own.
Unfortunately, yeah. Yes. Reuven, please unmute yourself.
Hi, Ruthie. With a quick question, what do you believe the Democrat Congress reaction will be when Israel wipes off the nuclear facility in Iran?
First of all, from your mouth to God's ear.
Amen.
Okay. Okay. I'll believe that when I see it. Okay. I pray for it, and I don't want to doubt our current government, or any government for that matter, in Israel, including Netanyahu's government. The question is, there are a few questions here, and it's under dispute in Israel, including among generals. A, does Israel have the military capability of doing that? Today, Israel is in a better position to do it because of the Abraham Accords, thanks to Netanyahu and Trump. The Abraham Accords established the ability, or created the ability, to use airspace that wasn't available previously to Israel in order to conduct such an operation. Number one, that's very important. But whether Israel has the technical ability to do it, I don't know. Whether the government has the political will to do it, I don't know. I doubt it, because the current Israeli government is made up of mostly left-wing progressives. The fact that there are so-called right-wing parties in the government, such as Naftali Bennett's Yamina party, doesn't really matter, because it's not pulling the strings. So again, I would find it hard to believe that this government, that also has an Islamist party in it, would vote for such an operation, would move to do it, to strike, other than these targeted strikes that we have been doing. We've been doing these little strikes, which are important, by the way, but they're not the big military operation that will end up being necessary.
Ruthie, one of the written questions is about Kamala Harris. Where does she fit into all this? Does anybody know, or all we ever seem to see from her is her cackling whenever she's asked a question? How do you assess her?
Yeah, Kamala Harris is an interesting figure, because she seemed to be one of these really sort of intelligent lawyers who was articulate. I was totally against her politics, but I heard her make cases during the Kavanaugh hearings, the Kavanaugh, Supreme Court Justice Kavanaugh. And though she was totally against the positions I held, I thought that she articulated them very well, and that she was very good looking, and she got me nervous. I said, oh my God, she's gonna end up the candidate, the Democratic candidate, because she's tough, and she's a woman, and she's articulate, etc. Since she's taken over her role, all she seems to be is a bumbling idiot. So from presenting a threat before, I think of her as a total, there's something totally ridiculous about her. And I don't see her as intelligent, but I do see her as part of the woke crowd, of course, take a knee to support, take a knee like Nancy Pelosi. We're all supporting, we all believe that white privilege is bad, and et cetera, which is, she's woke, but she's an idiot.
Yeah, I think we agree with you. Terry, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Good evening. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
I was interested in your underlying premise that the Democrats are anti-America, and that being anti-Israel follows on from that, because this is a trend that I see not just in America, but in the liberal democratic West generally. I was originally, in previous life, a POM, as we say, from the UK, and I look at my old country and see it there. France is facing rising Islamic population. They've got real problems, etc., etc. And the wokeness seems to be a reaction to all that, or part of it. And it worries me that the whole Western democratic world is leaning the way that America is leaning.
Yes. Is that
I
right,
totally
Ruthie?
agree
Do
with
you
that.
think America is setting a trend that the rest of us are unfortunately following?
Well, yes and no. I would say that America was following Europe's trend, that it started by following the trend, as Obama put it so aptly, leading from behind. You know, years ago, I can't remember what year it is, somebody here might remember, and it's easy to look up. There was a massive, massive heat wave in France. An unusual one, a really serious one. And because air conditioning, for some reason, the French seem to be too snooty to think that air conditioning is a good thing, you know, to American. I don't know, it's an American thing, who knows? Many, many, many thousands of people died, particularly in senior citizens' residences. Many more, by the way, than senior citizens' residents died of coronavirus. And during that heat wave, the French people did not return from their vacances to bury their parents because, you know, they were too busy on vacation and paying attention to which wine goes in which glass. Yeah. To, you know, stand up for Western values and, you know, and this, by the way, is how somebody like Marine Le Pen became popular. Again, in these countries, you have groups of people who say, no, no, we're great and our values are good, they're not bad. And we don't think that multiculturalism is a good thing. We think that immigrants should adapt our culture. We think that freedom doesn't mean the freedom to shit on your country, excuse my expression. And yes, America, I think it's circular. America does set those trends for sure, but, you know, because Hollywood is so international, et cetera. But it's circular because it goes back and forth between America and the countries that emulate America.
Yes,
it's really horrifying because the idea that somehow this brings us to what the woke people say that is so horrifying. They use the expression, my truth. You have your truth and I have my truth. There is no such thing as truth. There's no such thing as good and evil. There's no such, it's actually horrifying. And by the way, that goes hand in hand with abandoning the 10 commandments, you know, Christians, Jews, whoever. It goes hand in hand. It's saying, you know, there is no such thing as actual morality. And again, what is this my truth? Yeah, it's actually a horrifying thing.
Good point. We'll try and squeeze our last couple of questions in. Jeff, please unmute yourself.
Shalom, Ruth. I just wonder whether you could. Shalom, Ruth. Can you hear me?
Yes,
am I on?
yes.
Yes, I can.
Shalom. I just think maybe you should review your opening remark in which you said that the Democrats and socialists are not really true haters. They just happen to hate America and Israel comes along for the ride, which is contradicted by your subsequent comment in which you plainly said that the Democrats do not regard Israel as being an ally, which is as close to anti-Semitism as I really want to get without actually being. So how about you reconsider your comments?
I'm not sure if you understood them correctly. First of all, I didn't say the Democrats don't see Israel as an ally. And that wasn't my point. My point is that the Democrats have a bad view of American values, of the Western values. They have a dim view of power. And Israel fits into that context very well as an American ally. And the point about the Democrats is that it is not that there's Republicans and Democrats and Israel. There are left-wing Americans and left-wing Israelis who are on the same page. And there are right-wing Israelis and right-wing Americans who are on the same page. It doesn't divide along party lines within America. Israel is not uniform either. So my point, that was my point. My point had to do with the fact that when you have a president and an administration in the United States that is pro-America and believes in American power, that is necessarily going to be a pro-Israel administration.
Yes, yes. Okay, thank you.
That
Leon and then Hugh, we'll have to leave it there. So Leon, please unmute yourself. Leon doesn't have a camera, but ask your question. Leon? Okay, let's go to Hugh. Hugh, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hello, Ruthie. I'm in England actually, so it's earlier in the morning. Recently, I met with Lord Pollack, who is the honorary president of Conservative Friends of Israel, and he said that the current British government is probably the most pro-Israel government that has been in power since the days of Maggie Thatcher. And this week, Yair Lapid was in London, and they have signed a security agreement with Israel, the British government has. What do you make of that?
Well, we know that Boris Johnson is pro-Israel. I mean, he also has an affinity, personally loves Israel. He also spent time in Israel, I think on a kibbutz. And Boris Johnson also has a distinction as being among the British leaders who's not anti-American as well. I mean, you mentioned Margaret Thatcher. I think that's very relevant in Europe as well. The leaders that have anti-American or pro-American tendencies, that already makes a difference within their parties as well. I mean, especially if you look at the British Labour Party, and you can see the anti-Semitism goes along with the anti-Americanism and the anti-Westernism. So Boris Johnson, I think it's great that such an agreement was signed with Britain. I think it's sad that it needs pointing out. It should be something that is a given. And again, I hope that it means that when the time comes that Israel, I mean, it's too bad America should be the one bombing Iran, not Israel, but we all know that that's not likely to happen. I certainly hope that Israel's allies will step up in some fashion, yes.
Ruthie, a couple of people have asked on the chat about Nikki Haley. What do you see, if anything, happening with her?
Well, I think Nikki Haley's great. And if you mean, do I see her becoming, running for the head of the Republican Party in the next presidential election?
Yes.
I think it's definitely a possibility. Interestingly, there are a few people now who seem good. The trouble with Nikki Haley and some of the others, the trouble in America, the split among Republicans is also a problem. There are the anti-Trump Republicans and the pro-Trump Republicans, and the pro-Trumpers are very hostile now to the Republicans they feel are traitors. Let's put it that way. So that's a further complication. And Nikki Haley got bashed for daring to say to say something about the January 6th riots on Capitol Hill. So it's hard for me to say, especially from my perch in Israel, it's hard for me to say, which of the candidates are going to run in the presidential election, which is a while from now, run or try to get the Republican nomination. I can say to you, though, as I said when Donald Trump was running, that if a box of cornflakes were heading the Republican Party, I would still vote for it over any Democratic leader in the Democratic Party.
And what about Donald Trump? Do you see him realistically being a prospective president again?
You know, I don't know. It's like what people ask me whether Netanyahu is going to be the prime minister of Israel again. You know, I wish I had an answer, and I'm not sure, even though I supported both of them and I think that they did great things, I'm not sure it's a good idea to go backwards. I think what the trouble in Israel as well is that we've got to go forward with people who can follow in that kind of footstep.
Yes.
You know, we have to take into account that as much as we owe a leader, he's just a man, and we shouldn't turn him into a god, number one. And number two, people just die. They can get hit by a car, they can die of old age, they can get sick. The point is, you cannot put all your eggs in the basket of one person. You need to cultivate that person's leadership and ideology.
Well said.
Yeah, thank you. Ruthie, and everybody, we have run out of time. I'll hand over to David in just a moment, but Ruthie, I want to thank you very much for joining us. You've got an amazing knowledge and you express it so well. Do you have a blog, or do people look out for your articles in the online magazines? What's the best way for people to follow you?
Yeah, no, I don't have a blog. I write 2 columns a week, one in the Jerusalem Post and one in JNS. And I post them on Facebook and on Twitter and on LinkedIn. And you can read JNS articles by going to jns.org and the Jerusalem Post, jpost.com. Yes. And you can also Google my name or see, you know, as I say, I try to share my pieces as much as I can on the networks, on social media networks.
Yeah. Okay. So yes, I mean, I get your stuff that comes in automatically, so people can subscribe to JNS. That's really one of the better online magazines going around. So you'll see Ruthie's work there. So Ruthie, thank you so much. Again, it's been a pleasure catching up with you. We spoke with Ruthie a few times on Nothing Left, but we never actually sort of felt as if we were speaking with her face to face because it was radio, obviously. So it's just so much nicer to see you and to chat with you. And I want to thank you for joining us on our session today.
And thank you for having me.
Okay. Now, David, if you want to just quickly tell people what's coming up next week.
Yes, certainly. Next week, we have quite a treat. We have a member of the Knesset, a very outspoken and some would say controversial member of the Knesset, Amichai Hickley from the Yamina Party. I don't think we need to say more about that. And finally, as we always do, if you're not yet supporting AJA, please, when we close down tonight, go to the website, jewishassociation.org.au, join for membership, make a donation, and don't forget to like and follow our Facebook page in particular, where you get the news and views updates a few times a day.
Okay, thanks, David. Okay, so that's all we have for tonight. Michael, thanks for joining me again. It's always good to be back with you.
Yeah, and thanks, Ruthie. It was a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you so much.
Okay, that's all we have for tonight. If you're in the mood for some more Jewish-flavoured entertainment, Morris Klein's L'chaim program is on right now on 3ZZZ, FM 92.3 or 3ZZZ.com.au. For those in Australia, now's the time to go and light your Hanukkah candles. That's all we have for tonight. Don't forget you can keep up to date with what AJA is talking about on our Facebook page. Please share widely and like. And we do look forward to you joining us next week as usual, back on Wednesday night. But until then, we wish everybody a very good night. Thanks to everybody, and thanks again to you, Ruthie.